It's kind of terrible. What it really looks like is a physical and naturalistic world that has all of its problems and foibles, oddities and shortcomings. But the theist has to explain each and every one of them in light of omni-God. The universe is jam-packed full of these problematic corners that theists have to argue themselves out of. Why do we need this much energy, and why can't we get it from the sun? Why do we and other animals have to get it from the death of still other animals? And while you're at it, black holes. What's going on there? You can take this a step further. Maybe we don't actually need energy. God could have created organisms, a whole system that didn't revolve around our understanding of energy. This may sound bizarre to the naturalist, but we can throw out all of our frameworks and how we think universes have to work because God is omni-God. We, all living entities, wouldn't have to be scrabbling, fighting, competing amongst and with each other to merely survive if we didn't require energy. God could have created otherwise, or could simply play the perpetual miracle card. Further, God did not need to create a physical world at all. God could have just have created heaven and populated heaven directly. There's a thought to which we'll return later. I don't believe in free will. Well, libertarian free will as so defined, the real, rational, and conscious ability to do otherwise in any given scenario, all things remaining equal. I've written an awful lot on this, a book, 2 book chapters, and countless blog articles. I'm in good company since the vast majority of philosophers deny the existence of libertarian free will, and it turns out that the only ones who embrace this version of free will are pretty much those who believe in God as well. But more on that in a later chapter on free will concerning humans. It might seem strange that I include a chapter on free will in the context of God before the main chapter about free will, but for the purposes of this argument, let us assume that this version of free will exists. Many theists will say that God must have free will because it appears to be a great making property, in this case, in terms of human characteristics. The idea is that humans are endowed with it, and it indeed explains at least a lot of suffering. The suffering of murder and rape and genocide comes about through the bad decisions made by humans exercising their free will. This evil is explained and justified and essentially trumped by us humans exercising free will. It is that good of a characteristic that it outweighs all of the bad it can bring about. Being such a powerful tool, a great making property, surely God must have it. And this makes intuitive sense because one imagines, from a believer's point of view, that God freely decides to do things, but really could not do them if it so desired. The problem, and this is a genuine issue for free will as a concept as it applies to humans as well, is that what God desires is itself determined by its nature. With humans, there's a distinctive difference. We're not bound by abstract requirements of having to be all loving, and we certainly don't know everything, least of all every future event that will come to pass. In fact, all of God's omni characteristics constrain its actions. I use the word action here because I don't think God can make decisions. I don't think God can choose to do otherwise in a rational and conscious manner in any given situation. Making decisions entails deliberation, thinking about outcomes and weighing the consequences. God doesn't need to spend time thinking and deliberating, weighing up and evaluating. God is perfect. God is all loving. God knows everything. God has no need to waste time deliberating or calculating. God knows what the most loving thing to do would be and must do what is most loving. With an array of different options potentially available to it, God is unable to choose to do that which is not the most loving. It is a case of automatically doing that which is the most loving in order to fulfill its characteristics and its own once future predictions about itself and what it would do. To make sense of to make sense of freely choosing one option over another, an agent must be uncertain over the various options. The agent deliberates over which one to go for, thus giving the decision some rationale. But if you know what you're going to do indubitably in advance of doing it, you cannot make a decision. You are merely acting. Therefore, free will and omniscience are incompatible. God is rather like a divine robot, destined to do only that which its programming allows, with the programming being the fulfillment of omni characteristics. Anything that falls outside of that remit is invalidated. I've had theists reply to me when I point out that God countenanced rape in the Hebrew Bible, that God wouldn't do that, couldn't do that because of its nature. Well, yeah, that's the point. Omni God, Omni God's nature is not based on free will, and its free will is constrained like train tracks constrain a train trolley by its nature. All I am doing here is taking that idea and running with it to the finish line. Finally, God's free will is also further curtailed since, with its omniscience, it cannot act contrary to its own predictions. For example, if you were omniscient and omnipotent, and you predicted that you would make yourself spaghetti bolognese for supper on Friday, then when it came to making Friday's supper, you would have no choice but to make spaghetti bolognese. This is because if you decided to be contrary to your own prediction and cook, say, pizza, then your prediction would have been incorrect. This would render your omniscience faulty and would leave you with the characteristic of fallibility. Likewise, God does not have omnipotence because it cannot do something that would invalidate its infallible predictions. Or, looking from another point of view, God is entirely constrained by its own foreknowledge, which, as mentioned, would surely apply to God itself. Thus, God has no real and actual ability to do otherwise. So, logically, God can never be contrary to its own predictions. This has far reaching consequences. God does not have free will. Intercessory prayer is pointless. God cannot change its mind. God's own future and interferences on earth are determined. And the passages in the Bible where Yahweh changed his mind over the fate of Nineveh is patently false. After all, in God's nature, there is no change or shadow of alteration. That is from James chapter 1, verse 17. If you are feeling a bit biblically inclined, here are a few more that shows God's lack of free will and thus lack of omnipotence. There's Hebrews 6:17, Hebrews 6:18, Titus 1:2, James 1:13, and 2 Timothy 2:13, wherein which he says, if we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. Again, the following ideas here are essentially a continuation of the previous ones, whilst adding some more nuance. Omni God is omniscient and infallible. It knows everything and it cannot make mistakes. It also has full divine foreknowledge, according to such theists. Another claim we hear is that God is also immutable, meaning unchanging. This would be consistent with the other attributes above, and I have no problem with this given all the other characteristics involved. I've already discussed that God cannot have free will since God is constrained by its own characteristics, and this world must be a perfect world in some way, being the perfect creation of an omnibenevolent, omniscient God. With God's infallible foreknowledge, this means that God's predictions or knowledge about how the world will be cannot be wrong. Thus, from the moment of creation of space and time, God would know how the world would turn out to be from the first nanosecond to the last. The ramifications of God's foreknowledge are interesting. First, it arguably shows that we individuals do not have free will because it appears that we can only act out in one given way. Theistic libertarian free willers claim that God isn't causing us to act in a given way, it just shows what we will freely do. There are many problems with this. Let us start with the grounding objection. In order for us to do A in a certain scenario and not A, but not A in a different hypothetical scenario but A in a different hypothetical scenario and not A, it must be grounded in some causality or reasoning for God to know this and for it not to be random. There must be something about the scenario that causes A. It can't be grounded in God because that would mean theological determinism, meaning God causing events to be as they are. But the theist doesn't want the actions to be grounded in the causal circumstance or scenario, because this looks like ordinary causal determinism, and the theist claims we must be free. Likewise, an action cannot be grounded in the last variable here, the individual, for a number of reasons. As the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy points out, however, they also cannot be grounded in the individuals to which they refer for at least 4 reasons. First, counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are true prior to the existence of the individual to which they refer. Second, the existence of the individuals is dependent upon the will of God, and therefore The truth of the counterfactuals would also be dependent upon the will of God. Third, counterfactuals, properly speaking, refer to non-actual states of affairs, and therefore the events to which they refer never happen. And fourth, psychological makeup cannot serve as grounding because this suggests that the actions performed are not free, and thus the propositions describing the decisions/actions cannot be deemed counterfactuals of freedom. In fact, any variables that are deferred to in the individual are off limits for grounding because they merely invite causal determinism, whereby the grounding of the foreknowledge is in knowing all the causal determinants of a decision or action, including those of the makeup of the individual. So we have a bizarre situation of God knowing all creaturely decisions made in the universe from beginning to end, but the theist claiming the knowledge can't be grounded in the individual or the causal circumstance, and neither directly caused by God. This divine foreknowledge appears to render the idea of our free will incoherent, but it also invalidates God's own free will because it cannot act contrary to its own predictions about its own behavior. Given that God can only create in a way that fulfills its own omni-nature, and given that God can only do one thing and humans can only do one thing, then this world would just be a set of unerring dominoes falling down in a pattern set out from the outset. Nothing can change, not God's mind, not God's decisions, not human decisions, nothing about the world or reality from how God imagined and predicted it back at the very beginning. If you're a theist who believes in such a God, just think about that for a while. Consider the ramifications. God is immutable, unchanging, and unchangeable, and so is human behavior and the world at large. Perfectly so. God can't be surprised about it either. The universe is a clockwork machine playing out in the exact manner and to the exact outcomes that it designed and created. Either that or God doesn't exist, or God is not omni-God. Why we believe or not. The reasons why we believe are far more pertinent than the content of what we believe when we are interested in changing people's minds. As the old maxim goes, you can't reason someone out of a position they never originally reasoned themselves into. Belief is a psychological thing. We generally don't believe things like whether or not God exists after neutrally observing all of the facts and arguments concerning the subject and then reaching the conclusion to believe one way or the other. Instead, we often believe what our parents believe, or what we intuitively believe, or what we want to believe for psychological reasons. And then we spend the rest of the time post hoc rationalizing and defending that initial irrational or irrational belief decision. Non-belief or atheism or secularism often comes from finally realizing these arguments exist after a gradual process of niggling questions and doubts biting away at the edges. But it can equally come from a life-changing psychological event, such as a death, a divorce, or job loss. That said, such events can also send a believer into a more consolidated belief than they previously had. And this can happen in reverse, from non-belief to belief. It's just that statistically, the traffic is very much one way. In America, the UK, and other developed nations, non-belief is a growing demographic, and it's far more likely that someone will deconvert from religion to atheism or agnosticism and stay there than will convert from atheism to religion and stay there. Belief in God or gods is a complex thing that involves all manner of variables from psychology and rationality, as mentioned, but also culture, society, community, history, and so on. Interestingly, the countries in the world with the most existential security, meaning the least violence, the most effective welfare systems, the greatest education, the most certainty about their future, have the lowest levels of religiosity. People in war-torn countries whose lives are threatened continuously and who live in perpetual uncertainty have a greater adherence to religion and belief in gods because God, for them, provides some functional benefit. The fact that there are so many variables affecting each of our belief systems should not take away from the important one for anyone like myself: philosophy, rational argumentation. Bear with me a short while as I explain another reason people believe, well, more accurately, keep believing. Richard Dawkins, Susan Blackmore, and others have previously expressed the idea that memes and analogs that memes are analogs to genes, and analogous. Sorry. I think this is a useful analogy as to how memes continue to exist, though there are many detractors, but I don't think my basic idea is particularly controversial. So what is a meme? This is how I see it, not necessarily everyone else, and broken down for easy digestion. A meme is an idea, and ideas exist because they convey some kind of advantage to their users or have survival mechanisms, such as we might understand with genes and biology. Ideas either adapt to their environment or they die out because they convey no advantage to the organisms who hold them. In more recent years, memes on the internet convey humor or a poignant message, and so people who enjoy them pass them on to others. These ideas continue to exist because they have a competitive advantage over ones that die out. In the case at hand, imagine a memeplex, a whole network of ideas, such as a religion. Why might the belief in a religion like Christianity maintain over time? What advantage or survival mechanisms might it give or have? For starters, religions provide social function for adherents, a sense of identity that binds a tribe together and builds social cohesion. There's also attribution. Religious adherents can attribute divine explanation to things humans do not yet understand in terms of natural causes. Alternatively, even if humans do understand the workings of nature, those religionists can refuse to accept the outcome by attributing it to the will or existence of God. There might also be the idea, again wrapped up with social cohesion, that the religion also underwrites moral codes that bind the community together, so on and so forth. But the other very powerful characteristics that many of these popular religions so ubiquitously have are something I call mimetic fail-safes. These fail-safes are heaven and hell. Heaven is the single most amazing thing in human conception. When you ask someone what heaven is, it ends up being the greatest place, the greatest end result that they can possibly imagine. The same also applies to hell. It is literally the worst thing, the worst place, the worst end result that a human being can possibly conceive. Or heaven is the greatest carrot and hell is the greatest stick humanly imaginable. What this means is that religions that use these twin ideas have them as mimetic fail-safes that lock people into the religion beyond rational boundaries. It might be that you have a problem with certain aspects of Christianity, but to let these deconvert you is to deny yourself access to heaven and possibly condemn you to hell. Oh dear, you might as well keep believing, I suppose, right? Add to these other softer fail-safes like social networks that keep the believer locked in, and it becomes really difficult to have to leave a religion. In Bible Belt America, if you leave your church and deconvert, you're often ostracized by your community, family, and friends, and left out in the cold. You may even lose your job. In Afghanistan, you may lose your head. In this way, the threats are not only conceptual, promissory notes of a heaven or hell, but they're real, very real. In a versions of Pascal's wager, but one that really does operate ubiquitously at the back of believers' minds, as well as in their daily lives. What is Pascal's wager? Well, it's the famous argument for why you should believe on balance and surveying the four options available to you as I interpret it here. I'm looking over a diagram here in the book. I'm sorry. Okay, so we could add to this diagram the realities for some people in their communities as mentioned above. What you can see is that heaven and hell help to lock people into the belief that God exists. And this is further exacerbated by very tangible, real-world consequences. Now, there are some problems with Pascal's wagers, not least that belief in God is not your only God option. There may be as many as 4,200 religions in the world and 42,000 different denominations of Christianity alone. So getting it right is not simply believing in God or not. You need to get the right God. I digress. The point is, people believe often for psychological reasons and are then locked into those beliefs by conceptual bribery. Atheism is a tough sell. You die and you're worm food or ashes. Or, if you're being even more useful, being picked apart by a medical student or researcher and probably then worm food or ashes. Well, That gets them flocking to the atheist church. The thing is reality is reality. It's not a dress up marketing manager's dream project. It's just us. So I understand why there are still so many believers in the world at a time of such plentiful scientific discovery, understanding, and enlightenment. If humans were to be rational, however, strictly rational, I think religion would end up being adhered to by the tiny minority in society. If religion didn't have these psychological draws, these mimetic false fail-safes, and we were evaluating the claims on a purely rational basis, religion would struggle to maintain a foothold in society. In the next series of arguments, we look in finer detail at some of the issues pertaining to belief and the activity of persuading people into a religion, or as we'll see, being born into it. The accidents of geography and history. Hold up. Let me light this blunt. Beep, 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 bow. Boom. Hold up. Sit that one to the side and smoke that one later, cuzzo. Counter-apologist and philosopher of religion, John Loftus, wrote an excellent book called The Outsider Test for Faith. The argument in this chapter will borrow from the book to some degree. It's a great book, like all of his other works, and one that I suggest you read. As I have already hinted, there are many variables that are involved in why people believe in God, most of which are not particularly rational. The accidents of geography and history are prominent ones. The simple fact of the matter is that there's tremendous religious diversity in the world, but that diversity is ghettoized, isolated, or segregated by place or group. The distribution of religion is not random. This is how John Loftus sees it. People who are located in distinct geographical areas around the globe overwhelmingly adopt and justify a wide diversity of mutually exclusive religious beliefs due to their particular upbringing and shared cultural heritage. This is the religious diversity thesis, and it is a well-established fact in today's world. The problem of religious diversity cries out for a reasonable explanation, something that faith has not provided so far. The size of these groups is also diverse. We have 2.1 billion Christians, 1.5 billion Muslims compared to 23 million Sikhs, 4 million Shintoists, and everyone in between and even smaller religions. We have a further problem in that a given religion will itself be split into different denominations. For example, Christianity has some 42,000 different denominations, largely based on geographical and historical distribution, and often having a variety of competing or conflicting beliefs. Why is this a problem? Well, as an example, if you were an Arab born in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia in 1996, you are incredibly unlikely to be a Hindu. Indeed, it is almost certain that you will grow up being a Muslim. Likewise, you are unlikely to have primal indigenous beliefs or the power of the Amazon River growing up in a Lutheran community in Bible Belt, USA. Parents, families, communities, and societies so often define who we become and what we believe. There are, and this is an indisputable fact, distinct geographical concentrations of religions around the world. Christians may be concentrated in Europe, South and North America, and other pockets of colonial history. Islam prevails in the Middle East, North Africa, parts of subcontinental India, and the islands of the Indian Ocean. Shintoists primarily exist in Japan, and Hindus in India. These and other statistical generalizations and trends exist. If God were perfectly loving, then it would ensure that all people could participate in a relationship with God, unless people had somehow deliberately excluded themselves through some kind of resistance. Some philosophers call the people who under people who under other circumstances would have happily believed in the right God given the right context, non-resistant non-believers. They don't believe in the right God, not because they are wholly against the idea of that God necessarily, but because they just weren't lucky enough to be born in the right geographical area. The challenge for religionists is that most religions have it wrong. That is, religions are mutually exclusive. If I am a Muslim, I believe that the Muslim religion and revelation are correct, and I believe my religion is a more accurate representation of reality than that which a Jainist believes, almost certainly in India. And if access to heaven or hell or nirvana or whatever afterlife there is, or if access to God or if access to the fruits of belief in the correct God depends upon believing in the correct God, then there's a lot on the line. However, given the serious implications of belief, it seems rather bizarre that Omni-God would design, create, and arrange the world in such a way that most people don't rationally survey the smorgasbord of religious offerings and then, using logic and reason, assent to the correct one. Instead, they are overwhelmingly born into any given religion. The belonging to a particular religion depends on where and when they were born. And that might well be the component of their existence that informs the verdict of whether or not they access the good stuff or get condemned to the bad stuff. Perhaps for eternity, that is. It must be remembered that I'm generalizing here for simplicity and that the range of religions have a range of beliefs concerning afterlife and divine reward and punishment. As Loftus continues, the main problem religious diversity presents us with is that not every religious faith can be true. In fact, given the number of mutually exclusive religious faiths in the world, it's highly likely that the one you inherited in your respective culture is false. Robert McKim tells us that it is clear, therefore, that large numbers of people have held and now hold false beliefs in the area of religion. At most, one of them can't be true. At most, one of them can be true. And since so many people hold false beliefs in the area of religion, it would seem, therefore, that all groups need to consider the possibility that their beliefs in this area may be mistaken. It gets worse when you consider the vagaries of history. Imagine being born in Egyptian or Aboriginal Australian culture in 5000 BCE, before the events of the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Bible. Now imagine that Christianity is the one true religion. How is it fair, when one has no control over when and where one is born, that one is born into one of those contexts? The person would have absolutely no chance of being able to access the correct divine revelation upon which rests the reward of heaven or the punishment of hell. This presents arguably three options for the theist. First option, even though people end up believing the wrong religion, largely outside of their control, they can still access the good stuff. Heaven, or somehow some kind of union with the correct God. Secondly, God rearranges the world such that the soul of a person who is not able to access the correct God is already known by God to be a soul that would freely reject it. So God front loads that soul into someone who would have no access to this correct God anyway, throwing out the trash before the movie begins, so to speak. And lastly, God really did give secret individual revelations to those people born in the wrong times and places, so it's all okay, really. These options are evidently a trifle problematic. For option one, the corollary of this defense is that we don't really need to believe in the right religion in order to get to heaven. In the context of Christianity, this might mean that I don't need to have faith in Jesus in order to get to heaven. I can be an Aboriginal Australian or a Muslim or an atheist and still get into Christian heaven, presumably because I'm a good human being. In other words, it's about the deeds, the works, and not faith in Jesus and the other aspects of the Christian God. I think an awful lot of Christians would have a problem with this. Most religions seem to operate on a platform of, quote, believe our religious doctrine, the correct one, or you're in trouble, rather than, it doesn't really matter what you believe as long as you're a good person. Of course, for people like myself, the latter option is far more appealing. It's about having a world full of good people. The second option above, as espoused, for example, by Christian apologists like William Lane Craig, is, I think, fairly egregious. We will actually return to it fairly soon when considering heaven and hell, but in the meantime, it looks something like this, as set out by theist Tim Stratton. God knew that those who never hear the gospel would freely choose to reject it, even if they did hear it. Remember that God has perfect omniscience, therefore. He knows with certainty who would freely accept his offer of love and who would freely choose to reject him, even if they could do otherwise. Since God knows who would freely choose to reject him, why does God even need to let them hear the gospel, since he knows they would reject it anyway? I can imagine this unevangelized person face to face with Jesus on Judgment Day. This person might initially object and say, but this isn't fair. How could I have rejected you when I didn't even know about you? God would reply, I knew that even if you were face to face with me on earth, that you would have rejected me anyway. The defendant would then reply, well, that's right. I would have rejected you then, and I reject you now. God can make sure that those who would repent if they hear the gospel message will hear the gospel message. As an advocate of God's middle knowledge, I believe that God knows with perfect certainty who would repent after hearing about Jesus. Therefore, if hearing the gospel is necessary to be saved, God can make sure that those he knows would accept him will be born in a time and place in which they will hear the gospel. If God, with ultimate control and knowledge, knew that an entity it created would indubitably reject it, then in creating that entity, God is creating a human just so they can go to hell. What a piece of shit. I don't think either of these three options get the theist out of a bind. They're not good enough and look rather like desperate and ad hoc rationalizations. I would offer a fourth option to the ones listed above: universalism. This is the idea that everyone is eventually saved one way or another. If I were to be religious, this would definitely be the option I would take. I can make no sense of God at all. But if there were a God, this God and religion would be universalist. If I were God, everyone would eventually get the good stuff. After all, it would be my fault for knowingly designing and creating them in the wrong context anyway. But with most versions of God as we understand them, and given religious exclusivity, the scenario presented in this argument is as follows. Our beliefs will define whether we get the good stuff or don't. Our beliefs are overwhelmingly defined by when and where we are born. From 1 and 2, whether we get the good stuff or not is overwhelmingly defined by when and where we are to be born. We have no control over when and where we are to be born. Most people are born into the quote-unquote wrong places where beliefs prevail that preclude them from getting the good stuff. From 3 through 5, most people overwhelmingly have no control over whether they get the good stuff or not. A creator who knowingly designs and creates a world in which human beings are punished for something they have no control over is an unjust creator. God, being ultimately powerful and responsible, has control over everything. When and where we are to be born, the entire world into which we are to be born, who's to be rewarded and punished, and how, etc. God designs and creates a world in which it knowingly allows most people to overwhelmingly have no control over the good stuff or not. God knowingly designs and creates a world in which most people are punished and overwhelmingly have no control over their punishment. Therefore, God is unjust. One example out of many as to how omni-God cannot be fair or just, and by not being fair or just, is not omnibenevolent. Thus, if God exists, God is not omni-God. All right, that was the first. Okay. That was the first 10 reasons, or the first 10 arguments against the existence of God. So next time we'll start at chapter 11, Unfair Levels of Evidence. And again, this is the book we're reading. 30 arguments against the existence of God. And this is where we at. Unfair levels of evidence. I would read it like this. Like how they be doing and shit. Like, we often hear that God wouldn't put a cross on the moon as overwhelming evidence for his existence because it is just too overwhelming and doesn't give people the choice to believe. But this is thoroughly problematic. So that's where we'll leave it for today. You know what I'm saying? But before I go, praise Jesus.